On the Confederate side, the bloody day gave way to a night of restlessness. Beauregard moved his headquarters to Shiloh Church and summoned his commanders to that location. They congratulated him on his great victory and the conclusion of that victory the next day. Beauregard's actions demonstrated a lack of preparation. His orders to the men on the front line was to fall back a safe distance from the enemy and bivouac for the night. The cavalry were sent forward to make sure he was notified if the enemy approached. Finally, he ordered the commander at Corinth to form the stragglers into companies and regiments and send them to the battlefield. The Confederate troops, although exhausted, enjoyed themselves in the abandoned camps of the Union soldiers. A soldier from Missouri wrote, "Everything a soldier could want, to which we helped ourselves. We ate their grub and slept in their cots as quietly as if we had no enemy in 100 miles. Ammunition wasn't distributed even though cartridge boxes were empty. No significant defenses were thrown up. The Southern Army acted as though the battle was over and victory had been secured. However, most soldiers did not sleep as easily as the man from Missouri. Many of us could not sleep that night for talking over the happenings and incidents of the day," wrote a Tennessean. "A goodly number of our friends had been killed or wounded, and we were busy till a late hour loading up and hunting for our missing comrades and friends who had fallen. Many sad rehearsals of where this and that one had fallen." Throughout the night, the Union gunboats sent shells through the air, preventing either side from getting any sleep and adding to the anxiousness felt by the soldiers of both sides. Nathan Bedford Forrest, just a colonel at this point, was patrolling the front of the Confederate line, and he spied Buell's forces crossing the river. He even sent Confederate soldiers in blue uniforms into the Union lines to obtain more intelligence. He reported the happenings multiple times, but no one would listen. And he wasn't the only one seeing the Union forces grow throughout the night, but the warnings were not heeded. The actions of each army on the night of April 6th would decide the next day's battle. The rain poured down upon soldiers both blue and gray, and the thunder roared alongside the artillery of the gunboats. But as dawn approached, the storm began to pass. Because of its advanced placement at the end of April 6th, Pond's brigade was still on the front lines throughout the night because he did not receive word to pull back, and he knew the importance of his brigade to the Confederate left flank. It would be Pond's men that came into contact with the Union juggernaut first. Pond's artillery and the Union guns dueled for an hour from 5:30 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. As they threw shot and shell at one another, Grant rode over to Wallace and gave him his orders for the day. Wallace would constitute the extreme right wing of the Union Army and outflank any defenders in his way. The appearance of stiff resistance by Pond's men convinced Wallace to move slowly and cautiously toward the Confederate defenders at 6:30 a.m. It took him over 2 hours to cross Tilghman Branch and swing his division into line on the north end of Jones Field. Pond's brigade and Ketchum's battery performed a well-conducted withdrawal before Wallace's men could bring them to battle. Ketchum held the front line while Pond's infantry traversed the landscape to join the rest of the Confederate Army. Wallace paused at the north end of the field because the divisions of Sherman, Hurlbut, and McClernand hadn't moved to secure his left flank. Buell on the far left of the Union line was also moving slowly south, but it was mostly due to the terrain and the muddy mess created by the rain. As his men went through the former day's bloody fields, they found W.H.L. Wallace still alive. He was rushed to the rear where his wife was overjoyed to find her husband still among the living and the reports about his death being false. Buell's troops moved out from Pittsburgh Landing and crossed Dill Branch Ravine. His entire force was finally in position around 9 a.m. He had encountered a few skirmishers from Forrest's cavalry, but no heavy resistance. The two Union wings were exposed out in the open without their center. Finally, Sherman, Hurlbut, and McClernand moved out. It was 10 a.m. before the entire Union Army had formed a stable line to confront the enemy. The Confederate line was a jumbled mess. One contemporary wrote, "The Confederate line resembled a shuffled pack of cards in which none adjoins its next in suit except by chance." Beauregard attempted to place troops in anticipation of Grant's move south, and Confederate soldiers came from all over the battlefield to form their lines. One Kentucky soldier named John Caldwell was looking over the wounded and dead when he was ordered to fall in. The following is his account. "But before I go, I must look upon the faces of my noble dead. I have seen them again. The flaxen hair of little Tom Caldwell is matted over his once sunny face. Poor Land's face is so blackened by wound and forehead that I would not have known him but for wound and dress. Chestnut is calm as if sleeping. George Small's face is dark and lowering. The light of battle has faded from his face. My noble friend Casey appears to have been in great pain when he died. How I pity his family. Smith seems to have died easy. Johnson appeared calm. Tom Lyle suffered greatly, shot through the bowels. Walker suffered a great deal, but endured it like a man. Kennerly was in great misery, shot in bowel. John Pillow died last night. What a message I have for his family. Tell my mother I died like a soldier. It's an account like this that makes us realize that each soldier knew one another well in their own companies, regiments, and brigades, and after such a large battle, this kind of reflection was a common occurrence on both sides. Nevertheless, Beauregard cobbled together a defensive line that was poorly prepared for what awaited them. One of the hardest fighting units on the Confederate side on the first day would also be one of the first units to see action on the second day. General Chalmers on the far right flank of the Confederate Army formed up his men and readied them to defend themselves. However, he knew that his flanks would be in the air. Nevertheless, he encountered William Bull Nelson's division crashing over the landscape. The rest of that flank was wholly unprepared. General Withers and others were preparing to march to the west to find their divisions and corps, but when they heard heavy fighting to the east, they countermanded their previous orders. Chalmers held the blue troops at bay until the other units could get formed. General Cheatham's troops had marched all the way back to their bivouac location of April 5th, but were hurriedly on their way to the front. Those brigades came online as the Union troops pressed forward. Chalmers fell back and formed the extreme right flank of the Confederate Army. Southern artillery placed on the outskirts of the Bell Cotton Field harassed the troops under Colonel Sanders Bruce. The artillery fired such effective volleys that Nelson sent a request to Buell for artillery support. In the quick movement to arrive at Pittsburgh Landing, many artillery batteries had been left behind, but Buell secured him 2 batteries to duel with their Confederate counterparts. All the while the battle raged on the Confederate right, Beauregard was attempting to reclaim the success from the previous day. He wanted Breckinridge to lead an attack in the center and drive back the approaching Federals. Likewise, he wanted the wings to move up in support. He informed Hardee, the now commander of the right wing, even though many of his units were on the left flank, to move up and support Breckinridge. The brigade commanders got their orders and moved forward. It became the impression from the couriers that the troops were not to fire because Breckinridge would be in their way. As they approached the tree line in the field, the blue troops waited until the rebels got nearly within point-blank range and delivered a devastating volley into the gray troops. This stunned the men and the commanders, sending many regiments to the safety of the trees. It was a debilitating mistake. However, numerous assaults would be made against the blue line, but eventually the Confederate right flank settled down in a defensive position. The Battle of Shiloh was turning into a stalemate, with neither side able to dislodge the other. The gallant Chalmers saw an opening to hit Amon's flank and hopefully turn the tide of the battle. He grabbed the flag of the 9th Mississippi and called for his brigade to follow him. The charge smashed into Amon's flank, pushing back the blue troops and forcing him to divert his attention away from the Confederate units in his front. Chalmers hammered Amon's line repeatedly. Buell found a few regiments to send to Amon's aid. The 2nd Iowa, the 19th Ohio, and the 40th Illinois rushed to the flank and halted the Confederates in their tracks. Nelson ordered his brigades to advance toward the rebel line. Bruce's brigades took some of the heaviest casualties, attempting to cross an open field. Gallantly, they attacked the Confederates, and it broke out into hand-to-hand fighting in some portions of the line, especially when the rebels launched their own counterattack. A captain in the 2nd Kentucky described the fighting and his wounding. The shock of a musket ball striking one in the hip has about the same feeling as if a person is struck with a blunt instrument or club, and produces a paralyzing sensation, he wrote. He at first thought someone had hit him with a musket, and for an instant was rather angry at an imaginary assailant, but remembering that I had called out to a man in gray uniform who was pointing his gun toward me to drop his piece, as well as feeling warm blood running down my leg, soon convinced me that the Confederate soldier had not obeyed my order as promptly as I know my own men would have done. He later wrote, "My only fear for myself was that I would bleed to death, but by the use of a silk handkerchief I stopped the outside flow of blood by pushing the soft silk cloth into the entrance and exit of the bullet." Bruce's brigade retreated to the north end of the field. Those two battle lines stared at one another. To venture across the field was suicide. On Nelson's right, Hazen ran into a problem not experienced by Amon or Bruce. The left two brigades had to advance southward to hit the enemy, but Hazen had to turn to the southwest, exposing his flank. His men were fighting over the wheat field that had caught fire the day before, and the position of his troops made them succumb to flanking fire. Bruce sent the 20th and 1st Kentucky regiments to Hazen's aid. Hazen sought to break the enemy line, and when William Smith's brigade came up on his right, he believed he had the power to do just that, and he readied his men. A private asked an officer to take what money he had on him and to send it to his family in the event of his death. The officer told him that he had just as much of an opportunity to die in this charge as the private, and instructed him to give it to the surgeon. Hazen ordered his men forward, and within minutes that same private was shot through the forehead. Smith and Hazen's brigade smashed into one another, not being properly coordinated. Smith also had the 14th Wisconsin of Grant's army in tow. The Badgers had encamped near Smith's brigade, and without orders, joined the advance of Buell's army. The Blue Line busted through the 1st Confederate line, capturing a segment of the Washington artillery. One Ohio regiment lost 4 color bearers in that charge. The second line of Confederates held on for dear life until Bowen's reformed brigade and elements of Stewart's brigade counterattacked. It was enough to drive off the Federals. As the retreating blue troops made it to the wooded areas in relative safety from the rebel bullets, they reformed. The Southerners pursued, led partially by Hardee himself, who sustained a slight wound in the arm, but his jacket was riddled with bullet holes. They got hit in front and flank by the reformed blue troops, who weren't given up without a fight, and pushed back the rebels. It was a near stalemate on the Union left, but the Confederate center, commanded by Breckinridge, was in the process of making their assault. The Kentucky-born Indiana lawyer turned Kentucky State Senator Lovell Rousseau was a brigadier general in Don Carlos Buell's army the morning of April 7th. As it marched toward the Confederate position, Lovell remembered, within a quarter of a mile of the landing, and directly on the way to our position on the field lay hundreds of dead men, mostly our own, whose mangled bodies and distorted features presented a horrible sight. Numerous dead horses and our partially sacked camps gave evidence of the havoc and, which was far worse, of the reverses and disasters of the day before. Rousseau's march was part of the general advance of the divisions of McCook and Crittenden. They would hit the center right of the Confederate line and occupy the location their compatriots held the day before, called the Hornet's Nest. Across the field from them were the Confederates under former Vice President of the United States turned Confederate General John C. Breckinridge. Beauregard had big plans for Breckinridge, who was to launch the major assault against the approaching Union troops. However, before Breckinridge could get his men moving, at 11 a.m., Boyle and the other Union units were ordered to attack the rebel lines. Breckinridge's brigades delighted in the thought that now the blue troops would have to march through the open field of the Hornet's Nest to approach them. Boyle's men made a gallant charge and even captured some rebel artillery as they made it close to the tree line on the opposite end of the field. Here is where some accounts are mixed, but we do know that some of the Confederates had begun making their way into the field about the same time that the Union troops did. But we do know that the blue troops traversed the field further than the rebels and were driven back to the woods. Buell, knowing that Nelson was needing help on the left, ordered the 19th Ohio to be sent there. Boyle and Smith worked tirelessly to regroup Buell's men, and miraculously, they had reformed a couple of regiments by the time that Statham and Bowen's brigades approached the tree line and the blue troops defending it. At least 2 times the blue troops attacked the advancing rebels, and the galling fire forced both Confederate brigades to fall back and seek some protection. Statham's men halted in the open field, where Union bullets found them after a short stay. They moved into the trees and attempted to reform their shattered ranks. As they moved back, the Union regiments had made an appearance again at the north end of the field, but were kept in check by well-placed canister fire from Stanford's artillery battery. The 47th Tennessee had heeded the call for reinforcements at Corinth and joined Breckinridge's ranks, and the new troops helped to stabilize the depleted ranks. While much of the fighting occurred between the brigades of Bowen and Statham and Buell and Smith, Rousseau sent his brigade but was met with heavy resistance to the northwest of Duncan Field. Rousseau was the hinge between Grant's army and Buell's army, and Rousseau was incredibly concerned about his right flank. When the Confederates fell back to the safety of the woods, Anderson approached Trabue to aid him in attacking the Union line. Trabue refused, but it wouldn't be long before Braxton Bragg approached them and detached the 4th Kentucky and 4th Alabama Battalion to aid Anderson. When they attacked, it was at a critical juncture between the two Union armies, and Rousseau would have to throw in part of his division's reserves in the form of the 5th Kentucky. The rebels made a daring attack, attempting to exploit the small gap in the Union line, but the Blue Kentuckians were able to beat back the rebels. One of the Confederate Kentuckians who was mortally wounded that day was the Confederate governor of Kentucky, George W. Johnson, who had a horse shot out from him the day before and would join the ranks of the 4th Kentucky as a private. He would be left for dead on the field, but Union soldiers would find him and take him to a steamboat, where he would die a few days later. The two sides were in a standoff, with neither side giving in, each holding their positions at all hazards. One Indiana soldier wrote, "They fought like mad dogs. They would fall back a little and rally again and fight desperately. I just thought that they would fight us till they were all killed. They would come up in such good order, we would flank them, and we sometimes would nearly have them surrounded, but they would fight their way out." On the Union right, the divisions of Sherman, Hurlbut, McClernand, and Prentiss would slam against the Confederate line. Some rebel regiments had gotten separated from their brigades and found themselves alongside troops from different corps or divisions, but it still remained a strong line. Just like the Union troops in the center and on the far left, Grant's right flank would throw themselves up against a stubborn Confederate line. The Confederate left was the least secure of either flank, and many of the regimental commanders saw it for themselves, as it was not well anchored. When Grant ordered his men forward, the rebels were not satisfied with merely defending the ground. Generals like Bragg and Cheatham ordered their men forward to stymie the Union assault. A bloodbath ensued as each side threw lead into one another. Shaver's brigade was hit hard by musketry and artillery fire. A shell exploded over Shaver's head, knocking him unconscious. He awoke all alone on the battlefield, seeing neither friend nor foe. His brigade had moved back to regroup amid the chaos of stragglers and unaffiliated regiments. Wood's brigade also took heavy casualties from some well-placed artillery and fell back to regroup. Nevertheless, the battered Confederate and Union forces struggled back and forth, falling back to regroup and then launching another attack, neither side wanting to give in for long. In a unique moment in the battle, Charles Wright of the 81st Ohio remembered seeing a black man run forward with a cartridge box and rifle, placing himself behind a tree and firing into Confederate troops. As he fired away, he would glance at the Union troops, give them a smile, and continue firing. What transpired next was debated among veterans of the Army of the Tennessee, but elements of Marsh's brigade began to break apart, and many pointed to the 53rd Ohio as the first regiment to fall back, compromising the integrity of the entire line. After the 53rd made their way back to the rear, the rest of Marsh's brigade began to crumble. Hugh Carlyle, a member of Marsh's brigade, relayed a story exemplifying how battle doesn't allow men to think straight. A comrade who had gotten excited and shot his rifle with the ramrod still in the barrel ran over to Carlyle and asked him if he could use his ramrod. Carlyle told him that he had use for his ramrod, and told him to throw his rifle away and grab one laying on the ground with a ramrod. The soldier stated, "I believe I will. I never thought of that." Carlyle concluded, after a battle it was nothing unusual to find a ramrod sticking in a tree where it had been shot by some excited fellow. To the north, the Union and Confederate lines were reported to be no more than 30 yards apart when firing volleys. No shelter could be had for the prone soldiers except if within the tree line. To the south, Cleburne's brigade was playing a defensive role until Bragg ordered his brigade forward. Cleburne protested that they would be cut to pieces because their flank was unsecure, but Bragg ordered it anyway. As Cleburne moved his brigade forward, artillery fire shot out in front of his men from their own artillery. They hunkered down in a ravine until the artillery duel was over. When he moved forward, the thick undergrowth prevented him from seeing the enemy, and his men were cut down by the Union musketry. He was obliged to fall back. Further to the north, Lew Wallace's division, which hadn't engaged with the main Confederate line, approached the rebel flank. The troops under command of Zach Dees first encountered this new Federal division, and with pressure from the front and now their left flank, they were compelled to fall back, along with the brigades to their right. Although the attack came as a surprise to Bragg and the other rebel commanders, they worked tirelessly to hold the brigades together despite pulling back. It was a little after noon when Beauregard pulled back and formed another line after Wallace had outflanked him. The Confederate right was still in pretty much the same place as it had been since 10 a.m., but now the left would be tested even more as Federal troops concentrated against it. Rousseau's brigade drove the rebels ahead of him, but he was running out of ammunition. When his men fired their last shots, Rousseau asked Kirk to take the lead and he would follow close behind with the bayonet. McCook sent in Gibson's brigade as well, and McCook's whole division pressed forward. The Blue Juggernaut was only halted when Wood's brigade of Hardee's corps stood their ground and a bitter struggle took place between the two sides. McCook became concerned for his left flank, which could easily be attacked and overrun, but one of Hurlbut's brigades under Colonel James Veatch filled the gap. On the Union right, Grant's Army of the Tennessee was fighting with a renewed enthusiasm. Some of those wounded the day before came out of their sick beds to take part in the attack. Colonel Peter J. Sullivan of the 48th Ohio rejoined his command on April 7th after his wounding on April 6th and fought alongside his men until a bullet shattered his arm. On the Union right, Wallace made another flanking maneuver to force the Confederates to fall back. Couple that with McCook driving further into the rebel lines, and it nearly brought disaster for the beleaguered Gray troops. The pressure was too great, and Beauregard had to pull back his line to another position, closer to the Shiloh church. During the middle of the day, Beauregard had personally led at least 2 advances against the Union columns in an attempt to stymie their attempts to assail the rebel lines. But by 2 p.m., the Confederate commander knew that there was no use to continue to fight back. A withdrawal was needed. As each unit pulled back, elements of Breckinridge's corps constructed a defensive line to hold back the approaching Federals. In one of the last Confederate assaults of the battle, Colonel Looney cobbled together around 1,000 men, of which the 38th Tennessee was included, and charged to blunt the blue-coated troops to help buy time for their comrades to safely get back on the road to Corinth, Mississippi. Union forces encountered pockets of small resistance as they moved into their camps just south of the Shiloh church. As McCook's division moved through the area, a member of McCook's staff struck up a conversation with a mortally wounded Confederate who said he was a member of the 5th Kentucky Infantry. The dying Kentuckian asked if Thomas Crittenden was around and said that he and Thomas had played together as children, living on the same street in Frankfort. The staff officer ran to get Crittenden, but by the time the general made it to his friend, the Confederate was dead. Multiple reasons led Grant to not pursue the retreating Confederates. His men were exhausted. As he said, he had not the heart to send them forward. Also, he had received instructions to not move on Corinth. Buell stated that he didn't know the ground well enough to send his men on another assault. Sherman summed it up well when he stated years later that, "I assure you that we had quite enough of their society for 2 whole days, and were only too glad to be rid of them on any terms." The Union camps were destroyed from 2 days of fighting. One soldier found 128 bullets in his tent. One found large holes in his cooking stove. Others were horrified to find dead bodies laying in their tents. The next day, Sherman and part of Buell's army headed south, but ran into stiff resistance in the form of Confederate cavalry, led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Sherman sent out the 77th Ohio as skirmishers, and like an avalanche, Forrest Cavaliers and some Texas Rangers smashed into the Buckeyes, killing a great many of them. It was at this moment that one of the more famous episodes of the war took place, when Forrest had advanced too far ahead into enemy lines and was shot, but fought his way out of the Union lines. Sherman would recount later that, "I am sure that had he not emptied his pistols as he passed the skirmish line, my career would have ended right there." That fight at Fallen Timbers concluded the fighting. The Confederate army limped into Corinth over the course of the next couple of days. Back on the battlefield, Union forces began the gruesome work of gathering up the wounded of both sides. Musicians and chaplains helped bring in the wounded, and surgeons went to their dirty work. The stench from the dead bodies convinced one soldier to not even approach the battlefield. One soldier stated, "The rebels raised the black flag, and when I saw it, old Eli made good use of the bayonet as I passed the wounded enemy." Cap said, "I used my bayonet a little too much on the wounded." However, this was an exception. Most Union troops were humane. The green Union troops made problematic mistakes, like one soldier who decided to touch off a cannonball with a flame, and when it exploded, it mangled his leg and wounded several others. On April 9th, a campfire overheated a cannonball and it exploded, wounding several men. Care was given to the Union dead. A soldier from Illinois wrote, "As I write, volley and volley of musketry is being fired over the graves of our men. We dig long holes in the ground, lay them side by side without any coffin, fire a salute over the grave, and then cover their cold bodies with the Tennessee clay." The Union soldiers also had to bury the Confederate dead. They buried them in mass graves. The largest trench filled with dead Southerners was east of the Peach Orchard, but most of the mass graves were on the western side of the battlefield. They varied in number, with some containing 20 and others containing 150 men. A soldier from Illinois wrote, "Months passed before I recovered from the effects of it." The numbers were tallied up, and the Federals reported 1,754 killed, 8,408 wounded, and 2,885 missing, for a total of 13,047. The Confederates reported 1,728 killed, 8,012 wounded, and 959 missing, for a total of 10,699. The Union lost a little over 19% of their entire force, and the Confederacy lost just under 24% of their army. The civilian population around the battlefield was terrorized, and the battle in many ways ruined their lives. Only one civilian casualty emerged from the 2-day slaughter, but the lead-infused ground full of cannonballs and equipment, as well as dead bodies, made it nearly impossible to farm. The bullet-ridden trees made logging impossible. Many of their homes were destroyed, and they could never resume life like they had before the battle. Jefferson Davis mourned the loss of the battle and Albert Sidney Johnston, his friend from West Point. Johnston's body was transported to New Orleans, where it was buried, but it would later be removed to Texas. Numerous Northern civilians were appalled at the high casualty rates and called for Abraham Lincoln to remove Ulysses S. Grant, but the president stated, "I cannot spare this man. He fights."
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.